So the other day I was scrolling through the internet when I came across an interesting theory. What if the Faroe Islands were settled by the Egyptians? Faroe Islands, like pharaohs of Egypt. So I thought we'd do some digging and explore this idea. So first off, the origin of the name Faroe Islands is pretty unclear. We don't really know how far this name goes back. It's just always what the Norse, who were said to have arrived in the 9th century AD, have called it. Modern historians say the name was derived from the Old Norse word for sheep. But that word is fair, so that doesn't exactly make much sense to me. In actuality, the Norse may not have been the ones to name the island after all. In fact, many historians equate the Faroe Islands to an unidentified island in the Atlantic called Friesland that appears on many old maps and in stories going back to the Viking Age. And this island of Friesland was said to be home to the goddess Freya in Germanic traditions, with parallel stories existing of the goddess Athena in the Greek and Minerva in the Etruscan or Roman. There are also geometrically shaped mountains on the island that could very well be ancient pyramids built by these unknown people from mythology, as well as on other islands around the Atlantic. Was this the Egyptians? Or maybe they were travelers that came from some unknown predecessor civilization, like Atlantis. Let's keep digging deeper. The oldest settlements and artifacts on the island date back to the 9th century AD, at the height of the Viking Age, when travelers from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark ventured out into the Atlantic and settled areas as far as Greenland and North America. But that wouldn't be until 1000 AD with Leif Erikson's journey to Vinland. But the Viking sagas never mention the Faroe Islands, despite telling stories of the founding of settlements in Iceland, Greenland, America, and numerous places in Europe, but never the Faroe Islands. However, a piece of mythological writing from the Frisians, who were a Germanic people on the coastal regions of the Netherlands and northwest Germany, was said to have survived by being passed down as a family relic and came to light in the 1860s. Although it is said to be a forgery by 21st century historians, many in history have believed in its authenticity and say it's a story that has been told and retold many times, but originally dates back to the ancient Frisians, anywhere from 2200 BC to 800 AD. It is known as the Oera Linda Book, and speaks of a land up the coast of northern Europe where the goddess Freya ruled, and her people lived under the rules of liberty and freedom, making it a paradise. And this land was known as Atland, or Aldland. But similar to Plato's story, the landmass suffered a massive cataclysm and sunk under the ocean, leaving only a few survivors who escaped to the land of Phrygia in northern Europe. Here's a passage from the manuscript. This stands inscribed upon all citadels. Before the bad time came, our country was the most beautiful in the world. The sun rose higher and there was seldom frost. The trees and shrubs produced various fruits, which are now lost. In the fields we had not only barley, oats, and rye, but wheat which shone like gold, and which could be baked in the sun's rays. The years were not counted, for one was as happy as another. On one side were bounded by Ralda's seas, on which no one but us might or could sail. On the other side we were hedged by the broad Twiskland, Germany, through which the Finda people dared not come on account of the thick forests and wild beasts. Eastward our boundary went to the extremity of the East Sea, and westward to the Mediterranean, so that besides the small rivers we had 12 large rivers, given us by Ralda, to keep our land moist, and to show our seafaring men the way to his sea. The banks of these rivers were at one time entirely inhabited by our people, as well as the banks of the Rhine, from one end to the other. Opposite Denmark and Jutland we had colonies, and a Brugtamagd. Then we obtained copper and iron, as well as tar and pitch, and some other necessities. Opposite to us we had Britain, formerly Westland, with their tin mines. Britain was the land of the exiles, who with the help of their Burgtamag had gone away to save their lives. But in order that they might not come back, they were tattooed with a bee on their forehead, the banished with a red dye, the other criminals with blue. Moreover, our sailors and merchants had many factories among the distant Cracolanders, and in Lydia, or Libya. In Lydia, the people are black. As our country was so great and extensive, we had many different names. Those who settled in the east of Denmark were called the Jutland, because often they did nothing else than look for amber on the shore. Those who lived in the island were called Letton, because they lived an isolated life. All those who lived between Denmark and Sandval, now the Scheldt, were called Stoorleden, or pilots. Zeecampers, navalmen, and Angelaren, fishermen. The Angelarens were men who fished in the sea, and were so named because they used lines and hooks instead of nets. From there to the nearest part of Cracoland, the inhabitants were called Catamers, because they never went to the sea but remained ashore. Those who were settled in the higher marches bounded by Twiskland, Germany, were called Saxmannen, because they were always armed against the wild beasts and savage Britons. Besides these, we had the names Lanzetin, natives of the land, Marzetin, natives of the fens, and Wood or Hoot Zotten, natives of the woods. How the bad times came. During the whole summer, the sun had been hid behind the clouds, as if unwilling to look upon the earth. There was perpetual calm, and the damp mist hung like a wet sail over the houses and the marshes. The air was heavy and oppressive, and in the men's hearts was neither joy nor cheerfulness. In the midst of the stillness, the earth began to tremble, as if she was dying. The mountains opened to vomit forth fire and flames. Some sank into the bosom of the earth, and in other places mountains rose out of the plains. Aldland, called by the seafaring people Atland, disappeared, and the wild waves rose so high over the hills that everything was buried in the sea. Many people were swallowed up by the earth, and others who had escaped the fire perished in the water. It was not only in Findesland that the earth vomited fire, but also in Twiskland, Germany. Whole forests were burned one after the other. Our land was covered with ashes. Rivers changed their course, and at their mouths new islands were formed of sand and drift. During 3 years this continued, but at length it ceased, and forests became visible. Many countries were submerged, and in other places land rose above the sea. And the wood was destroyed through the half of Twiskland. Troops of Finda's people came and settled in the empty places. Our dispersed people were exterminated or made slaves. Then watchfulness was doubly impressed upon us, and time taught us that union is force. 101 years after the submersion of Aldland, a people came out of the east. That people was driven by another. Behind us in Twiskland, Germany, they fell into disputes, divided into 2 parties, and each went its own way. Of the one no account has come to us, but the other came in back of our Schoenland, which was thinly inhabited, particularly the upper part. Therefore they were able to take possession of it without contest, and as they did no other harm, we would not make war about it. Now that we have learned to know them, we will describe their customs, and after that how matters went between us. They were not wild people, like most of Finda's race, but like the Egyptians, they have priests and also statues in their churches. The priests are the only rulers. They call themselves Magurs, and their headsman, Magi. He is high priest and king in one. The rest of the people are of no account, and in subjection to them. This people have not even a name, but we call them the Finns, because although all their festivals are melancholy and bloody, they are so formal that we are inferior to them in this respect. But still they are not to be envied, because they are slaves to their priests, and still more to their creeds. They believe that evil spirits abound everywhere, and enter into men and beasts. but of Ralda's spirits they know nothing. They have weapons of stone, the Magyars of copper. The Magyars affirm that they can exorcise and recall the evil spirits, and this frightens people, so that you may never see a cheerful face. When they were well established, the Magyars sought our friendship. They praised our language and customs, our cattle and iron weapons, which they would willingly have exchanged for their gold and silver ornaments. And they always kept their people within their own boundaries, and that outwitted our watchfulness. 80 years afterwards, just at the time of the Jewel Feast, they overran our country like a snowstorm driven by the wind. All who could not flee away were killed. Freya was appealed to, but the Schoenlanders, Scandinavians, had neglected their advice. Then all the forces were assembled, and 3 hours from Godesberg, they were withstood, but war continued. Kat, or Katarine, was the name of the priestess who was Burgtamagd of Godesberg. Kat was proudly and haughty, and would neither seek counsel nor aid from the mother. But when the citizens knew this, they themselves sent messengers to Texland. Minna, this was the name of the mother, summoned all the sailors and the young men from Oostflyland and Denmark. From this expedition the history of Woden sprang, which is inscribed on the citadels and here copied. At Aldergamud there lived an old sea king whose name was Styric, and whose deeds were famous. This fellow had 3 nephews. Woden, the eldest, lived at Lumkamakia, near the Emud in the Oostflyland. He had once commanded troops. Tunis and Inca were naval warriors, and were just then staying with their father at Aldergamud. When the young warriors had assembled together, they chose Woden to be their leader or king, and the naval forces chose Tunis for their sea king, and Inca for their admiral. The navy then sailed to Denmark, where they took board Woden and his valiant host. The wind was fair, so they arrived immediately in Schoenland. When the northern brothers met together, Woden divided his powerful army into 3 bodies. Freya was their war cry, and they drove back the Finns and the Magyars like children. When the Magi heard how his forces had been utterly defeated, he sent messengers with Truncheon, who said to Woden, "O Almighty King, we are guilty, but all that we have done was done from necessity. You think that we attacked your brothers out of ill will, but we were driven out by our enemies, who are still at our heels. We have often asked your Burgtamagd for help, but she took notice of us. The Magi says that if we kill half our numbers in fighting with each other, then the wild shepherds will come and kill all the rest. The Magi possesses great riches, but he has seen that Freya is much more powerful than all our spirits together. He will lay down his head in her lap. You are the most warlike king on earth, and your people are of iron. Become our king, and we will all be your slaves. What glory it would be for you if you could drive back the savages. Our trumpets would resound with your praises, and the fame of your deeds would precede you everywhere." Woden was strong, fierce, and warlike, but he was not clear-sighted. Therefore he was taken in their toils, and crowned by the Magi. Very many of the sailors and soldiers to whom this proceeding was displeasing went away secretly, taking Kat with them. But Kat, who did not wish to appear before either the mother or the general assembly, jumped overboard. Then a storm arose and drove the ships upon the banks of Denmark, with the total destruction of their crews. This strait was afterward called the Kattegat. When Woden was crowned, he attacked the savages, who were all horsemen, and fell upon Woden's troop like hailstorm. But like a whirlwind they were turned back, and did not dare to appear again. When Woden returned, he was incensed with herbs, but they were magic herbs, and by degrees he became so audacious that he dared to disavow and ridicule the spirits of Freya and Ralda, while he bent his free head before the false and deceitful images. His reign lasted 7 years, and then he disappeared. The Magi said that he was taken up by their gods and still reigned over us, but our people laughed at what they said. When Woden had disappeared some time, disputes arose, We wished to choose another king, but the Magi would not permit it. He asserted that it was the right given to him by his idols. But besides this dispute, there was one between the Magyrs and the Finns who would honor neither Freya nor Woden. But the Magi did just as he pleased, because his daughter had a son by Woden, and he would have it that his son was of high descent. While all were disputing and quarreling, he crowned the boy as king and set up himself as guardian and counselor. Those who cared more for themselves than for justice let him work his own way, but the good men took their departure. Many Magyars fled, back with their troops, and the sea people took ship, accompanied by a body of stalwart Finns as rowers. Next comes upon stage the history of Tunis and Inca. When Tunis wished to return home, he went first towards Denmark, but he might not land there, for so the mother had ordered, nor was he to land at Flyland, nor anywhere about there. In this way he would have lost all his people by want and hardship. So he landed at night to steal and sailed on by day. He at length arrived at the colony of or Cadiz. Here they bought all kinds of stores, but Tuntia, the Burgtmagd, would not allow them to settle there. When they were ready, they began to disagree. Tunis wished to sail through the straits to the Mediterranean Sea and enter the service of the rich Egyptian king, as he had done before. But Inca said that he had enough of all those Findas people. Inca thought that perchance some high-lying part of Atland might remain as an island, where he and his people might live in peace. As the two cousins could not agree, Tunis planted a red flag on the shore and Inca planted a blue. Every man could choose which he pleased, and to their astonishment the greater part of the Finns and Magyars followed Inca, who had objected to serve the kings of the Findas people. When they had counted to the people and divided the ships accordingly, the fleet separated. We shall hear of Tunis afterwards, but nothing more of Inca. Tunis coasted through the straits of the Mediterranean Sea. When Atland was submerged, there was much suffering also on the shores of the Mediterranean, on which account many of the Findas people, Krakenlanders, and people of Lydia's land came to us. On the other hand, many of our people went to Lydia's land. The result of all this was that the Krakenlanders far and wide were lost to the superintendence of the mother. Tunis had reckoned on this, and had therefore wished to find there a good haven, from which he might go and serve under the rich princes. But as his fleet and his people had such a shattered appearance, the inhabitants on the coast thought that they were pirates, and drove them away. At last they arrived at the Phoenician coast, 193 years after Atland was submerged. Near the coast they found an island with 2 deep bays, so that there appeared to be 3 islands. In the middle one they established themselves and afterwards built a city wall around the place. Then they wanted to give it a name, but disagreed about it. Some wanted to call it Friesburg, other Niftunia. But the Magyars and Finns begged that it might be called Thiersburg. Thier was the name of their idols, and it was upon his feast day that they landed there, and in return they offered to recognize Tunis as their perpetual king. Tunis let himself be persuaded, and others would not make any quarrel about it. When they were well established, they sent some old seamen and Magyars on an expedition as far as the town of Sidon. But at first the inhabitants of the coast would have nothing to do with them, saying, "You are only foreign adventurers, whom we do not respect." But when we sold them some of our iron weapons, everything went well. They also wished to buy our amber, and their inquiries about it were incessant. But Tunis, who was far-seeing, pretended that he had no more iron weapons or amber. Then merchants came and begged him to let them have 20 vessels, which they would freight with the finest goods, and they would provide as many people to row as he would require. 12 ships were then laden with wine, honey, tanned leather, and saddles and bridles mounted in gold, such as had never seen before. Tunis then sailed to Flymere with all his treasure. Now the question remains, where was this lost land of Atland? The text gives us clues but no exact description. The two most probable locations for this land is the sunken landmass between England and mainland Europe known as Doggerland, that was said to have been submerged sometime around 6500 BC. The second is the island that appears on many old maps from the 16th century and prior, known as Friesland. The name Friesland alone is so similar to Phrygia, it would make perfect sense that this island was their original homeland. However, this island, which appears on old maps between Iceland and Scotland, is nowhere to be found in the real world. It's what's known as a phantom island. But historians say it was most likely a depiction of the Faroe Islands, which very well may have been a larger landmass in ancient times. The sea levels were said to have shifted rapidly, somewhere around the beginning of the Holocene period 11,000 years ago, and for some time after that, and then again in the late 1200s and early 1300s AD with the Little Ice Age, which was said to have led to the abandonment of Norse settlements in Greenland and Canada. On these old maps, Friesland is depicted with cities and settlements, so there were thought to be people living here. And if these stories from the Oer-Linda book are true, then there is a direct link to the ancient Egyptian civilizations, and others in the Mediterranean, possibly going back all the way to the age spoken of by the Egyptian priest Solon and Plato in the Timaeus and Critias texts. This may be the Germanic version of the story of Atlantis, and if it's true, then the Egyptians and Germanic people were descended from the same lost civilization. Early Irish monk travelers were also said to reach this island in the early 6th century AD. According to medieval texts, the Irish navigator Saint Brendan set out across the Atlantic with his comrades from 512 to 530 AD, and supposedly found a land dubbed the Isle of the Blessed. Later in 825 AD, the Irish monk De Quille wrote that some northern islands had been settled by hermits for at least 100 years, and their artifacts have been found. But how did they know how to reach this small group of islands in the North Atlantic? This was even before the founding of Iceland. Nobody knew what was up there. But they very well could have been following stories from ancient travelers or legends from Celtic and Germanic lore. In Irish mythology, we're told of a semi-divine people known as the Tuatha De Danann. The age of the Tuatha De Danann is generally placed somewhere around 2000 BC or earlier. However, this is a very loose dating, because the stories are considered mythology. But the Tuatha De Danann, or the folk of the goddess Danann, another goddess figure similar to Freya, were a supernatural race who were said to have built the giant mounds and megalithic structures around Ireland. They were said by medieval Christians to be the descendants of the fallen angels, or Nephilim, who survived after the flood and practiced elemental magic. They were called God-men, or tribe of gods, and were immune from aging or illness. Their stories read like many mythologies we find in almost all ancient cultures. But it is likely that these ancient mythical people were based in reality, shown by their structures they left behind. And if they were, they would have easily possessed the ability to travel north of Ireland to the Faroe Islands, like the later Irish monks did. And this date of pre-2000 BC coincides perfectly with the traditional dating of the pyramids in Egypt, and many say the Egyptians actually came from this early Irish civilization. If we travel across the Irish Sea to Scotland, we find another connection with ancient Egypt. There is a story dating back to medieval Ireland and Scotland that many still believe today, of a princess that traveled all the way from Egypt, escaping her family's fall from power. Her name was Princess Scotia, or Scotta, and she is said to be the namesake and founder of Scotland, going back to the 4th century BC. The story says that a Persian invasion of Egypt caused her and her people to flee and escape to the land of Ireland and Scotland, where she created the Gaelic language. This points to Ireland and Scotland having been an outpost or settlement under Egyptian rule, and possibly during the age of the Tuatha De Danann, this was vice versa, and Egypt was a settlement of theirs. This pyramid in the Faroe Islands might predate the ones in Egypt, and may even be what they're based on. Let's take a closer look at this so-called pyramid in the Faroe Islands. For one, it does look a lot like the surrounding features, and it could just be a mountain. However, this would be what would happen to a giant monumental pyramid if it had been completely covered by ocean and sediment at one point, like the stories say. Powerful tsunamis could have buried and dissolved more distinguishable features, leaving only natural stone that looks just like the surrounding landscape, aside from its pyramidal shape, which is what we do see here. It really is geometric, and may have even been a terraforming project where the people shaped the actual mountain, like we see in the Inca and even the Maya civilization. It does have a sort of shaped step look to it. It's also located on a very southern island of the chain, reaching much closer to Ireland and Scotland than the rest of the Faroe Islands. Even if this structure isn't a pyramid, we do find confirmed pyramidal structures on the Azores Islands and on the Canary Islands. They say these were built by Phoenician settlers, because Phoenician coins and other artifacts have been found on these islands. But maybe these are the remains of the Frisian travelers that brought their gold from Phoenicia to Skymir. Maybe the Azores and Canary Islands are Skymir, as mentioned in the Oer Linda book. And maybe the other traveler, Inca, made it to the remains of Atlant, and was the Viking who first settled the Faroe Islands. We also have theories out there of druids originating from Egyptian priests. The theories are difficult to prove, but they bring up similarities in practices and symbols, as well as many linguistic similarities. And the Celtic and Druid culture was said to once extend all the way through Europe into the Black Sea region. There is one more point I thought of while researching this. The Old English word for fairy, fae. Maybe this land wasn't named after the sheep, Freyr, or the goddess Freya, but it was named after the fairy folk, or fae, the Faroe Islands, where the pharaohs lived. Maybe this is where the word pharaoh comes from. I don't know, just another weird thought. It's probably nonsense. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this one. I'm not quite sure it's 100% solid, but there is some weird ancient stories that raise a lot of questions that might be answered with more archaeological research in the Faroe Islands. Thanks for watching. If you want to start watching these ad-free and get access to all the videos I watch and articles I read in my research for only $3 a month, go sign up for our Patreon. The link is below. See you next time.